Scarecrows are one of the Magic the Gathering's many creature types that have received tribal support over the years. Many of these tribal decks have been unsuccessful, but none have been quite as strange as Scarecrows. The main problem isn't just that the cards are underpowered, it's that the mechanical identity is so muddled and the design decisions are so questionable that Scarecrows have become sort of iconic in their own way. Sure, they're not even remotely playable, but they do so many unique and interesting things and are so all over the place that tons of players have fallen in love with the tribe. So today, we're going to go over the entire tribe and answer this simple question: why? Normally for these kinds of videos, we like to go in chronological order to see how the mechanics or the tribe have changed over time. But there's really only one place that this video can start, and that's with Reaper King. There's a lot to talk about here. Normally on this channel, we start explaining a card by quickly going over its mana cost, but in this case, that's not really an option. The Reaper King costs 1 2-bid mana of each of the 5 colors. This is a mechanic introduced in Lore and Block to go alongside hybrid mana. Rather than paying 1 or either of the 2 colors, you pay 1 colored mana or 2 colorless. This was intended to let you splash cards in any color of deck, but at a cost. However, Reaper King is a pretty good showing of why this mechanic is not good. You can either cast Reaper King for 1 mana of each color, or 10 generic mana. For reference, for that much mana you could also cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, and probably win the game on the spot. Realistically, you'd never cast Reaper King for more than 5 mana, and if you did, it was because your mana base wasn't cooperating that day. You would do everything you could to avoid that situation, and there was never really a time when playing Reaper King in a deck without all 5 colors of mana was really considered. Mana efficiency is simply far too important to ever willingly pay extra mana for a spell. Honestly, you would often be better off just actually splashing the extra color in your deck than paying the full 2-bid cost. The mechanic is also somewhat confusing for new players. It's not immediately obvious how the cards that interact with cards like March of Otherworldly Light that care about a card's mana value. The mana value is calculated as if the 2-bid was 2 mana. So, as Reaper King says, its mana value is considered to be 10. However, the cards are still all the colors they would be if the 2-bid mana was colored mana. So it's sort of simultaneously both the generic mana cost and the color cost. With how bad 2-bid mana was competitively, and the fact that a lot of newer players were confused by it, it's not surprising the mechanic was retired basically immediately. And now that we've finished talking about its mana cost, we can go on to what the card actually does. Reaper King is a 6/6 legendary Scarecrow artifact creature. It has 2 abilities. The first is giving all Scarecrow creatures you control +1/+1. This ability is pretty nondescript. Basically, every tribe gets effects like this, and Reaper King is a bit pricey for a card that gives this kind of buff. Cementing both of these points is a card like Adaptive Automaton. This is an artifact creature that costs 3 mana and lets you choose any creature type when it enters the battlefield. It's that creature type and gives all your creatures of that type +1/+1. This is, compared to most of the lords, an overcosted generic option that lets any tribe fill out playsets of lords. So, if you're a tribal payoff that costs more than 3 mana, you need to be doing something really impressive. Luckily for Reaper King, basically nothing on the card matters except for its last ability. Whenever another Scarecrow enters the battlefield under your control, you destroy target permanent. This one line of text has made Reaper King and Scarecrows in general sort of famous amongst Magic players. This ability is somehow simultaneously incredibly overpowered without making Reaper King an even remotely playable card. It's almost impressive how poorly balanced this ability is. So, what's wrong? Well, let's start with what happens if things go right for you. If you have Reaper King out and all of your Scarecrows get a Vindicate staple to them, a removal spell so strong that Wizards has seldom printed cards even comparable to it, this will swing the tide of the game into the Reaper King player's hands wildly if they're able to cast any Scarecrows. They'll not only be able to develop their board, but they'll get to eat away at your opponent's board at the same time. And worst of all, Reaper King's text is missing a very important non-land clause. If you ever don't have enough valuable targets on the board, Reaper King players will start destroying your lands, and soon leave you without the ability to do anything at all. If you're an avid commander player, this is likely what you know the card for most. The card also lacks any restrictions concerning how the Scarecrow enters the battlefield, which means it will also trigger off of a number of other cards shooting out Scarecrows. This, of course, leads to Rite of Replication. This is a 4-mana sorcery that creates a token that's a copy of target creature. The scary part comes in with the kicker. If you pay an extra 5 mana while casting the spell, you instead get to make 5 copies of the target creature. Now, if you cast a Rite of Replication targeting Reaper King, the legend rule will kick in and make you sacrifice all but one of them. However, they still do enter the battlefield, and even more importantly, they enter simultaneously. This means they all see each other copy hit the field. While they will all die immediately, the initial Reaper King that was copied will still trigger 5 times from 5 copies being made, allowing you to destroy 5 permanents. And it doesn't stop there though. Each of these copies enter simultaneously to the other 4 Reaper Kings, which will allow them to trigger 4 times. So you have 5 Reaper Kings triggering 4 times each on top of the original Reaper King triggering 5 times for a total of 24 permanents being destroyed. In a game commander, this will usually destroy every good card your opponents have alongside most of their lands. And just a little tip for anyone trying to use this combo, if there aren't enough permanents to blow up, you are allowed to just target the same permanent several times. It won't do anything, but since they're all separate instances of the ability, they all resolve individually. You don't need to blow up any of your own cards or play a card like Darksteel Citadel to eat the erroneous triggers, like I've seen certain players claim. Now, this is incredibly broken. However, this is what Magic players call magical Christmas land. It essentially is just the best possible case scenario, and in reality, what happens most often is you cast Reaper King and your opponent uses murder on it, and then kills you in a combat because, as we'll talk about soon, the rest of the Scarecrows are kind of terrible. Playing Reaper King is like flipping a coin to see who'll eventually get to play Magic for the rest of the game. On one side, you have the scenario where you get to untap with Reaper King and blow up all of your opponent's cards by just casting your card. On the other, far more common end of things, you'll spend 5 mana on a creature only for it to immediately get removed, or not have the follow-up Scarecrows to cast, or just lose against an aggro deck before you get 5 mana in the first place. Most of the time you cast the card, it just doesn't do anything. However, despite not being at all practical, it's still powerful enough that it will steal games if Reaper King isn't killed on sight in a given board state. Essentially, despite being generally useless, Reaper King was still strong enough to lead to horrible non-games where only one player gets to play. While Reaper King isn't the perfect top end, if the deck he was part of was good, it would still be able to be successful. Unfortunately, there weren't that many Scarecrows, and almost none of them played well together. The tribe had 2 main themes, -1/-1 counters, and caring about the colors of your cards. Notably, neither of these themes synergize, nor do they have anything to do with each other at all. The -1/-1 counter theme is quite weak, with very few cards that interact with the mechanic. Cards like Lockjaw Snapper had the ability to put a -1/-1 counter on each of your opponent's creatures that had a -1/-1 counter on it when it died. None of these were particularly good, similar to the strength of most -1/-1 counters back in the block. The only card from this half of the block that's really notable is Grim Poppet. This costs 7 generic for a 4/4 that enters the field with 3 -1/-1 counters. You can remove one of them to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This is a card that simply costs way too much mana for its effect. For reference, 2 years later they would release Skin Render, a card that had essentially the same impact on a game for half the mana. This is by far the best card in the archetype that uses -1/-1 counters. The other half of the deck is based around having cards of a certain color in play. There's one cycle of 5 Scarecrows, such as Jawbone Skokin, that gives abilities to creatures of a certain color. You also have a cycle of 5 Scarecrows that would all gain certain abilities based on what color of creatures you had in play, such as Rattleblaze Scarecrow. Each of these Scarecrows would gain 2 abilities this way, and every color would always give the Scarecrows the same ability. If you had a white creature, they would gain Vigilance. If you had blue, they would gain Flying. Red gave Haste, and black would give them Persist. Meaning that if they die and they don't have a -1/-1 counter on them, you return them to the field with a -1/-1 counter. Finally, if you had a green card, certain Scarecrows would gain Wither, meaning any damage they deal to a creature is dealt as -1/-1 counters instead. The most important part of all these cards are the Scarecrows that can gain Persist, as the deck has a few cards that interact with this mechanic very favorably. First was Chainbreaker, which costs 2 mana for a 3/3 and enters the field with 2 -1/-1 counters on it. You can pay 3 and tap it to remove a -1/-1 counter from one of your creatures. This allows you to remove a -1/-1 counter from one of your Scarecrows with Persist to effectively reset the ability. This is made even better by the only other real Priest of Tribal Scarecrow supported in the game besides Reaper King, Scarecrow. This is a 1/2 for 3 with the abilities where you can pay 1 mana and sacrifice a Scarecrow to draw a card. You can also pay 4 and tap it to return target artifact creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. This would allow you not only to recur your Scarecrows, but you could sacrifice your Persist Scarecrows to draw a card and then use either Scarecrow itself to reanimate them after they die, or use Chainbreaker to reset the Persist so you could draw again. So the most synergistic strategy for the deck was to play the Persist Scarecrows alongside Scarecrow, Chainbreaker, and Reaper King. That is, if we ignore the one very obvious issue at hand. Most people watching the video will realize that the Persist Scarecrows requires a black creature on the field to have the ability. However, all of the Scarecrows, except for Reaper King, are colorless artifacts. If you're playing a Scarecrow deck, the only way to turn on this ability is to have your 5 mana top end threat in play. I said earlier that Reaper King was like flipping a coin to see who actually got to play Magic that game, and this is a big part of why. For the deck's cards to do anything, you have to have exactly it in play, because it's the only colored Scarecrow. It's difficult to express within the PG rating of this video how bad this makes the deck. One removal spell basically blanks all the cards on your board. A lot of the time, your opponent doesn't even need to find removal. You just won't find Reaper King on turn 5, and your naturally garbage cards will leave you in a losing position already. The perfect encapsulation of how horrible this mechanic is Lure-bound Scarecrow. This is a 3 mana 4/4 with the ability where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. And if you ever don't control a card of the chosen color, you sacrifice it. The card just self-destructs if Reaper King isn't on the battlefield. The card is actually better outside of Scarecrow decks because you can much more consistently have a card of the right color in play, so it doesn't literally destroy itself. Wizards seem to have realized this was an issue, so they gave the deck several cards to get around this. Scuttlemutt and Scrap Basket both had abilities that let you change the colors of your creatures for a turn to get around this downside. Notably, both of these effects are until end of turn effects, so they don't actually help you keep your lure-bound Scarecrow around. They also got Painter's Servant, a 2-mana Scarecrow that most people watching this video probably forgot was even part of the tribe. This is a 1/3 that lets you choose a color as it enters the field and turns all cards everywhere into that color for as long as it's on the field. Famously, this is one half of the Grindstone combo that results in instantly decking out your opponent. Servant could let you turn one of the colors of your Scarecrows on, but it had all of the same issues as trying to use Reaper King to make your Scarecrows playable. While it didn't lose as hard removal thanks to costing way less, it still means that your deck is way too reliant on drawing very particular cards to be able to play. Now, it's worth saying that this entire detour around having cards of the right color in play for your Scarecrows whose abilities all care about the color of your cards is very dumb. A huge amount of the tribe's design space is spent fixing a problem that never needed to exist. All Wizards would have to do to fix this is add a few colored mana symbols into the cost of the Scarecrow cards. That's not to say that they would fix the entire tribe, as they would still be overcosted and understated, but they would at least not be effectively blank pieces of cardboard in most board states. It would have made casting a removal spell on Reaper King merely backbreaking as opposed to a near-death sentence. This leads to an obvious question. Why are Scarecrows like this? Why do they have all these abilities based on colors and so few colored cards? The answer is likely that most of the Scarecrow cards were designed for a limited. They're all low rarity cards with the exception of Scarecrow and Reaper King, and cards like Weldfast Monitors show up in almost every limited environment. Their main purpose is to give any color of deck playable creatures, while still supporting certain colors more than others. Scarecrows were meant to be drafted in certain colors and limited to supplement other strategies, rather than being a strategy and draft unto themselves. Lure and Block had a big Colors Matters theme in Limited, with tons of cards like Disturbing Plot with the Conspire keyword caring about the color of your cards, and multiple hybrid spells making getting cards of different colors into play more practical. While this does explain this rather puzzling design decision, it only leads to another question. If the cards weren't designed to be played together, why give them multiple high-rarity tribal payoffs? Scarecrows already had a fairly strong mechanical identity just with the low-rarity options. They didn't really work as a deck, but that was fine. It was clear that they weren't supposed to be played together, and the identity of Scarecrows being a tribe used to supplement other strategies would be more than fine. However, Wizards apparently wasn't satisfied with this, and really wanted Scarecrows to be a tribal deck, despite the fact that the Scarecrow's only ability makes playing them together actively bad. Really, at this point, no amount of support would have made playing Scarecrows worth it. At least no support that you could reasonably print. Even a card with an incredibly powerful ability like Reaper King doesn't make the Scarecrows playable. One of the best indications of this is how players build Reaper King commander decks. Sure, a lot of people play as many of the Scarecrows as they can stomach put it into the deck, but that's not the best way to build the deck. The best way to build Reaper King isn't building Scarecrow Tribal, but building Reaper King Tribal. By playing as many clone effects as possible, preferably ones like Spark Double that become non-legendary copies, you'll end up being able to destroy an absurd number of permanents. Rite of Replication is the single card that gets the most bang for its buck right away, but any clone effect could do a lot of work with the king. Even in the one place where Scarecrows being bad wouldn't be much of an issue, they're completely outclassed by other strategies. Before we leave the plane of Lauren, we need to go over the few notable tribe members that haven't been brought up yet. Painter's Servant was already mentioned, but it bears repeating that the card is part of a powerful legacy deck thanks to having one of the most unique abilities in the game. Outside of Servant, very few Scarecrows could really do anything. The most notable Scarecrow we haven't named yet is playable. This is a 2-mana 1/1 Scarecrow with Flying, and the ability where you can pay 2 mana and untap it to add 1 mana of any color. And yes, this is an untap symbol instead of a tap symbol, because Lauren was just chock full of awful ideas. This card is just overcosted mana fixing most of the time. However, using the untap symbol for its ability has allowed it to see play in certain combo decks, which, for the record, is the only way that any untap cards have ever done anything. You see, untapping as a cost of an ability allows you to much more easily loop abilities, as so many cards throughout the history of Magic have used tapping cards as a cost. For an example, Grand Architect allows you to tap an untapped blue creature you control to add 2 colorless mana, but you can only use the mana to cast artifacts or activate the abilities of artifacts. It also lets you pay 1 blue to make an artifact creature blue for the turn, allowing you to tap them for the mana. The combo is pretty intuitive once you put the 2 cards next to each other. You make playable blue with Grand Architect, then tap it for 2 mana with the Architect's ability. Then you pay the 2 mana back into playable and untap it to make another 1 mana of whatever color you want. This puts you in the same spot you started in, but having netted 1 mana. Looping this allows you to make infinite mana, which if you have any outlet for, you can just win the game there. This was never good enough in constructed format, as better infinite combos were always available. However, in Commander, where you always have access to cards like Urza Lord High Artificer in your Commander Zone, you can make sure you always have the ability to win once you get the mana. As a result, playable is famous amongst Commander players for being a card that you have to kill on sight before your opponent does something really unfair. The only other halfway decent Scarecrow in the block was Heapdoll. This is a 1/1 for 1 that you could sacrifice to exile a target card in a graveyard. This card can stop some of your opponent's graveyard combos, but is generally outclassed by cards like Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, Tormod's Crypt, etc. etc. The card was never worth playing, but at least it had a technically useful ability. And with that, we've covered every Scarecrow that's worth talking about in Lorwyn. You have a few cards that combo with cards not even in the Scarecrow theme in playable and Painter's Servant, and a bunch of beaters that are actively worse as part of the deck than they are separately. Reaper King, who's best used separately from all of the members of his kingdom, and Scarecrow, whom for some reason cost 3 mana to cast instead of a reasonable amount. All in all, none of the cards feel like they make any sense. It leaves you asking why Wizards made just about any of the decisions they did with designing the cards. That is to say, they're perfectly at home in Lorwyn. Leaving Lorwyn behind, Wizards has never really returned to Scarecrows as a card type. Scarecrows have been returned to infrequently ever since Lorwyn, usually with just 1 or maybe 2 random Scarecrows shown up in a set where they were lore appropriate. For the most part, they're featured as low rarity mana fixing for draft. Cards like Shire Scarecrow and Signpost Scarecrow both allow you to pay mana to add mana of any color. Neither of these are good enough that you want to play them in Constructed, or really even be that excited about playing them in Limited. You played them to make sure that your other cards were castable more than anything. There's also some random Scarecrows like Field Creeper, which are just badly statted bodies with no abilities at all. In other words, for the past decade and changes since Lorwyn, Scarecrows have basically just been pack filler, designed to give every deck something to fill their draft decks with if things went south. There's really only one Scarecrow that's been printed in the past decade that's worth talking about at all, and that's Scaretiller. This is a 4 mana 1/4 Scarecrow with the ability where, whenever it becomes tapped, you choose one. You either put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is probably the 6th most powerful Scarecrow in Magic, behind the few other good Scarecrows we've covered. The ability to ramp out lands is incredibly powerful, and having access to the effect in any color is very useful. However, what makes the card so interesting is the fact that it can get lands from the graveyard and that it triggers whenever the card is tapped. This usually means that it just happens whenever the card attacks, but there are ways to take advantage of this. By utilizing Zoran Orb to allow you to sacrifice your lands, Retreat to Korlheim, which has the ability where you can tap or untap target creature whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, and any card that can tap Scaretiller, such as Grand Architect, you can gain infinite life, and make infinite mana depending on what you're using to tap the Scaretiller. Once you get all 4 cards in play, you can sacrifice a land orb for 2 life. Then you tap the Scaretiller with whatever card you're using, in this case the Architect. You'll trigger the ability to get the land back. This will trigger your Retreat to Korlheim, which will then allow you to untap Scaretiller. You can then sacrifice the land to the orb again in order to start the loop again. The combo is obviously terrible. The playable and Grand Architect combo both only requires 2 cards that are less expensive to cast than these in play, and also isn't good enough for the cards to break into non-commander formats. It should go without saying that these Scaretiller lines aren't exactly competitive. And all of this to say that we haven't gotten any real Scarecrow support since Lorwyn. Finally, this brings us back to the last question of the video. If cards like Reaper King and the other Scarecrows are fairly popular, Why hasn't Wizards ever given them more support? You may say they simply don't think the cards are popular enough, but that clearly isn't the case. In one of the very first Secret Lair drops, a set of special promo cards that Wizards sells online directly to players, they included Reaper King in a drop called Kaleidoscope Killers. This drop included the King, the Dragon, and Silver Overlord, and was sold for a total of $40 directly to players. Wizards thought these 3 cards were popular enough that players would pay around that much money for special, limited time versions of them, and they were right. Now, Reaper King is the least expensive of the 3 cards on the secondary market, but Wizards did think it was a worthy inclusion alongside these other 2 5-color legends. They clearly thought there was at least some interest in the card, even if they expected Dragon and Overlord to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of selling the product. Wizards isn't avoiding printing more Scarecrows because the player base has no interest in them whatsoever. Rather, it may be that they think it would be too difficult to print more good Scarecrow support. The only place where you could really want to play Scarecrows at this point is in Commander, where you can build around Reaper King. However, this runs into the issue we've talked about earlier, namely that Reaper King's destruction ability is either completely useless or broken, and there's not really much in between. If Wizards supported Scarecrows more, then the tribe would make an incredibly annoying and unfun deck to play against. The fact that Reaper King has to be played with a bunch of clones or changelings in order to work is kind of the only thing stopping it from being hated on as a commander. The fact that the card is kind of bad despite reading so powerful is a big part of its charm. If people started playing Reaper King at your locals and their decks were good, people would not have a very positive reaction to the tribe anymore. In a way, Scarecrows are kind of trapped, where they're unplayable but can't really be made better without turning the player base against them. So that's Scarecrows. They were introduced back in Lorwyn as support for draft, but received some of the most baffling tribal support of any creature type. Immediately after the block, Wizards abandoned the tribe, seeing the writing on the wall. Since then, Scarecrows have been few and far between, with none of them being worth writing home about. Despite all of this, or maybe because of it, there's a small section of the player base that has fallen in love with the tribe. But thanks to how overbearing the few good cards in the archetype are, Wizards can't really try and salvage the tribe without doing a lot of work. As such, Scarecrows have been abandoned by the game, left in the field to gather dust as the rest of the world goes on without them, much like the real-world objects they're based on.